Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth. This is our little space where curiosity gets to stretch out and get comfortable, and where the universe's big questions can arrive without any rush. The thought for tonight is a strange one, but it's the kind that can quietly find a place in your mind and just stay there, long after you first heard it. This isn't about the latest news or what's trending in science this week. It's the kind of question you might bump into late at night when the house is quiet, and your thoughts start to wander a little further than usual. It's about whether the very first civilization on our planet was actually ours. Now, I know that sounds like the opening line of a sci-fi novel, maybe something with alien visitors or lost continents sinking dramatically beneath the waves. But the idea I'm talking about is much closer to home. Let's try to imagine the true, staggering history of our planet. We're talking about billions of years, a timeline so vast that our entire human story, every empire, every invention, every single person you've ever read about, fits into just the last tiny sliver. A fraction of a percent. The rest of that time, the overwhelming majority of it, is filled with oceans and volcanoes, dense forests and deep ice. It's a history populated by creatures we can only meet through their fossilized remains. And perhaps, just perhaps, something else. Something that thought, and planned, and built, long before the first humans ever picked up a tool. Before we dive any deeper, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you somewhere the night has already settled in? Or is the sun just coming through your window? Maybe you're on a long drive, with the world blurring quietly past your window. Or maybe you're sitting perfectly still in that one chair that always feels like yours. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is for you, we're meeting right here in this shared moment, to lean into an idea that asks us to imagine a world we can no longer see. If this kind of journey feels like the company you've been looking for, calm, steady, and curious without being in a hurry, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd give this a like, or subscribe, or maybe even share it with someone else who might appreciate a few gentle thoughts tonight. It's a small gesture, but it really helps these quiet conversations find new ears. In a way, it's like leaving a light on in the window for fellow travelers in the dark. So, let's start somewhere simple. Let's think about the Earth itself. Not our Earth, but the Earth as it was before a single person walked across its surface. There were no cities, no farms, no roads, no voices that sounded anything like ours. But there were skies. There were seas. There were endless coastlines that have shifted and reshaped themselves over and over again. Entire mountain ranges have risen up and been worn down to dust in the time before the first humans arrived. If you looked at a map of the continents from back then, you wouldn't recognize it. Land masses drift across the planet's surface over millions of years, colliding, breaking apart, and sometimes vanishing completely under the ocean. It's tempting to picture this pre-human Earth as empty, but it was anything but. It was teeming with life, with creatures filling every possible corner, every niche. Some swam, some flew, some crept along the forest floor. Many of them were nothing like anything alive today, and some of them, just maybe, had the first sparks of something we would recognize as intelligence. We tend to see human intelligence as this one, unique superpower that sets us apart from every other species. But the reality is that intelligence is scattered all across the animal kingdom in the most surprising ways. Crows and parrots can solve complex puzzles. Dolphins can recognize their own reflections. Octopuses have been seen using tools. That's just the world as it is now, with us in it. What if there was a time when that intelligence didn't just flicker in a few clever individuals, but became the bedrock for an entire civilization? One that rose and fell, long before we were ever here to witness it. The biggest problem with this idea is that the Earth is a forgetful host. It holds on to some secrets for a very long time, but it erases others almost instantly. A city built today, if abandoned, starts to crumble in a matter of decades. In a few hundred years, it would be a ruin overgrown with plants. In a few thousand, the last obvious traces could be gone. Give it a few million years, and the ground itself will have shifted. The weather will have worn down solid stone. Rivers and seas will have changed their courses. Even our most durable materials, like metal and concrete, would be broken apart, scattered, and buried under new layers of earth. It's not that the evidence would be intentionally destroyed. It's just that our planet is constantly turning over its own pages, writing new chapters on top of old ones. If a civilization had existed, say, 50 million years ago, would we even know? We'd like to think so. We imagine archaeologists carefully digging down to find stone temples, sculptures, or tools. But that really only works for human history because we're only looking back a very short distance. The oldest stone structures built by humans are only around 12,000 years old. That's a blink of an eye compared to the Earth's age. If we tried to find something from 50 million years ago, we'd be digging in rocks that were forming back when that civilization's cities were still standing. And those rocks have been through a lot since then. They've been compressed, twisted, fractured, and even melted. They've been carried for miles from where they first formed. The older the layer of rock, the less it remembers. This is part of what led some scientists to propose what's called the Silurian hypothesis. The name actually comes from a bit of science fiction, but the idea behind it is a serious one. It asks a simple question. Could we detect an industrial civilization in the geological record millions of years after it vanished, even if there were no direct artifacts left behind? Would there be chemical traces, layers of unusual metals, changes in the atmosphere recorded in ice or rock? The answer is maybe. We already know that our own industry has left a permanent signature in ice cores, in sediments, and in the thin layer of radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing. Those signals could last for millions of years, long after our buildings have turned to dust. But they're subtle, and they're easy to miss unless you know exactly what you're looking for. If that's true, it opens up a very strange possibility. Maybe we've already walked right past the faint traces of something older without ever realizing it. A strange streak of metal in a cliff face, or a mineral deposit with an unusual composition. We might have classified it as a natural feature, without ever stopping to consider that it could be artificial. That's not because scientists aren't thorough, it's because the idea of a pre-human civilization is so far outside the normal range of possibilities that it isn't the first explanation anyone would reach for. Thinking about this doesn't mean we have to believe in secret histories or hidden conspiracies. It's really just an exercise in humility. We love to think of ourselves as the first, the only, the pinnacle of life on Earth. But we are just one part of a much bigger story, one that's still being written, and one that has already seen more change and upheaval than we can easily picture. We know that mass extinctions have reshaped life on this planet again and again. We know that entire ecosystems can rise and collapse in what is, geologically speaking, an instant. And we know that intelligence isn't a straight ladder with us perched at the top. It's more like a branching, tangled tree that has grown in many different directions over time. So, if there was a civilization before us, what could it have been like? That's the question we'll start walking toward next. For now, it's enough to just hold the idea in your mind, to picture the deep past as something richer and stranger than the empty wilderness we sometimes imagine. The continents weren't where they are now. The air might have felt heavier, warmer, or colder. The animals would have been completely unrecognizable. And somewhere in all of that, perhaps there were minds working together, shaping their environment, telling their own stories, and then disappearing before we ever had the chance to meet them. Before there were people to write down dates, before there were calendars or clocks, before the very idea of keeping track of years even existed, the Earth was already ancient. By the time the first humans showed up, the planet had lived through billions of sunrises and sunsets long enough to wear entire mountain ranges down to nothing, and long enough to raise new ones up from the seabed. The continents you see on a map today weren't fixed in place. They wandered slowly across the globe, colliding, breaking apart, and drifting like enormous stony rafts on a sea of molten rock. If you could have looked at our world from space tens of millions of years ago, the outlines of the land would have been completely unfamiliar. You'd still see the blues of the oceans and the whites of the clouds, but the shapes of the continents and the patterns of the seas would be strange and new to your eyes. The climate wasn't always what we know now, either. There were long stretches of time when most of the planet was warm and humid, covered in lush forests that reached almost all the way to the poles. There were other times when ice spread so far from the poles that even the equator felt the chill. Seas rose and fell over and over again, drowning vast coastal plains and later revealing them once more. Whole ecosystems came into being and vanished in cycles we can only piece together from the clues left in the rock record. The Earth never stood still, and it never will. In those immense ages, life filled almost every possible corner of the planet. The ocean floors, deep in the crushing dark, were teeming with creatures that never saw the sun. Coral reefs grew, died, and grew again in new places. Swamps echoed with the calls of animals we'd struggle to even imagine without the help of fossils. On land, there were forests filled with trees whose closest relatives are long gone now, and beneath their branches moved creatures of every conceivable size. Insects were among the oldest of them, well established long before the dinosaurs ever appeared. Birds evolved from small feathered dinosaurs and learned to ride the winds that shifted and swirled above those ancient forests. And mammals were there too, though for much of that time they were small, often living in the shadows of their much larger neighbors. If you could somehow stand in one of those ancient landscapes, it might feel familiar at first. A tree is still a tree, after all, and water still flows downhill. The air would still move in gentle breezes and rush in powerful storms. The sun would still rise in the morning and set at night, but the details would be profoundly, deeply unfamiliar. The sounds would be all wrong to your ears. The plants might be similar to what you know, or they might be alien in shape and form, with leaf patterns evolved for climates that no longer exist. The animals would be a bizarre mix of the recognizable and the strange, some distant ancestors of creatures alive today, and others that left no descendants at all. Many of these species lived together in herds, flocks, and colonies. They communicated in ways that are completely lost to us, using sounds or colors or movements that meant something specific to them and would mean nothing to us now. They hunted. They migrated. They raised their young. Many of them had brains capable of complex behaviors, though perhaps not in ways we would immediately recognize as civilized. And yet, when we start to think about the possibility of a pre-human civilization, this is where the mind begins to linger. Somewhere among all those countless forms of life, could there have been one that took a different path? One that began to change its environment in deliberate ways, not just for immediate survival, but for comfort, for art, or even just for the satisfaction of its own curiosity. We know it's possible for such a thing to happen, because it happened with us. Our own journey from small bands of hunter-gatherers to the builders of sprawling cities took hundreds of thousands of years. Our intelligence didn't just appear overnight. It was shaped by the climate, by geography, and by the constant grinding pressures of survival and adaptation. So it's not a huge leap to imagine that if another species had found itself with the right combination of abilities, problem-solving, communication, the use of tools something similar could have begun in the deep past. Not in our timeline, but in one of the many, many others that existed long before we were here. The trouble is that the record of these ancient times is incredibly incomplete. Fossils are rare. They only form under very specific conditions. Most living things simply vanish without a trace when they die. Their remains are scattered, eaten, or decomposed. Even when bones are preserved, they tell us very little about behavior. A skeleton can reveal the size and shape of a brain cavity, but it can't tell us what thoughts passed through that brain. It can hint at how an animal moved, what it ate, and how long it lived, but not at the complexity of its culture. Stone tools and structures survive much better, but only if they're buried in a way that protects them from erosion and tectonic activity for millions and millions of years. And so much of the Earth's surface has been recycled. The crust isn't a permanent stage, it's a constantly shifting set of platforms. Oceans open and close, swallowing old seabeds and creating new ones. Mountains are ground down into sand and gravel, carried away by rivers, and spread out in new layers somewhere else. Any trace of a civilization that existed before us would have had to survive all of that. And the odds of that happening are vanishingly small. Even if some trace did survive, we would still need to recognize it for what it was. A piece of worked stone from tens of millions of years ago might be dismissed as a natural rock formation unless it was found in just the right context. A smudge of unusual chemistry in a rock layer might be passed over unless someone specifically thought to look for industrial causes. When you truly grasp the scale of time involved, it becomes much easier to see how something so significant could disappear almost entirely. Imagine an entire continent, covered in forests and dotted with the towns and cities of a species we never met. Over millions of years, sea levels rise and fall. Glaciers advance and retreat, scraping the land clean. Volcanoes erupt, and the ground itself buckles and shifts. In the end, almost everything they made is gone. A few stubborn traces might be left, maybe buried deep under layers of sediment, or perhaps trapped in an ancient seabed that has now turned to stone. But the rest is gone, as if it never happened at all. We can point to places where the Earth has held onto a memory for far longer than usual. There are fossilized forests where the ancient trees still stand, perfectly turned to stone. There are insects trapped in amber for tens of millions of years. There are footprints, pressed into soft mud, and preserved when that mud became rock. These are geological accidents, lucky moments in time saved by unusual conditions. For a whole civilization to be recorded like that, it would take a truly remarkable combination of luck and geology. Without it, their existence would just slip away into the same deep silence that has swallowed so many other species. Thinking about this doesn't require us to believe it happened. It just opens the door to the possibility. And once that door is open, it's hard not to wonder what such a civilization might have looked like. Would they have lived in great numbers? Or in small, scattered communities? Would they have built with stone, or wood, or in materials that decay too quickly to leave much behind? Would they have shaped the land to suit their needs, or moved with the seasons, leaving only the lightest marks on the world? Would their art have been something we could even recognize? Or would it have been expressed in colors and forms that made sense only to them? We don't have the answers, but we do have the ability to imagine. And sometimes, imagination is the very first step toward discovery. Scientists form hypotheses not just from existing evidence, but from new ideas about what kind of evidence to look for. And an idea like this one, about the possibility of a pre-human civilization, can fundamentally change the kinds of questions we ask when we study the deep past. The Earth has been many different worlds over its lifetime. Each version had its own climate, its own landscapes, its own unique collection of life. The version we know now, with its familiar mix of oceans, continents, and polar ice caps, is just one in a very long series. Long before we arrived, there were sprawling jungles where there is now desert, and thick ice sheets where there is now open sea. There were animals whose shapes we would barely recognize, and plants that would look utterly out of place in any modern forest. Somewhere in all that constant, magnificent change, it is not impossible to imagine that intelligence rose once before, lived out its time, and then was gone. And if it did, then the Earth itself is the only witness that remains. Long before we appeared, the Earth was not silent. It was filled with sounds that belonged entirely to other species. The rush of wind through plants that no longer exist. The low calls of giant animals whose bones are the only part of them we can still find. The endless shifting, grinding, and trickling of water as it carved its way through landscapes that would have been unrecognizable to us. And somewhere in that ancient mix, there may have been minds that worked in ways we would understand. Minds that noticed patterns, that remembered things not just for survival but for their own sake. Minds that imagined outcomes before they happened. Minds that dreamed. It's tempting to think of dreaming as something uniquely human, tied to our ability to tell stories and picture things that aren't right in front of us. But we know animals dream. We can see it in the way their brains behave during sleep, in the way a dog's paws will twitch as if it's running, or how a bird's eyes will move beneath its closed lids. Dreaming seems to be something that brains just do once they have enough complexity to process memory and imagine different possibilities. It doesn't require a language like ours. It doesn't require cities or books. It simply requires a nervous system capable of weaving together experiences into something more than just a simple replay. If that's true, then there could have been many species before us that dreamed. Most of them, we can assume, dreamed in ways shaped by their own immediate needs. Dreams about hunting, about avoiding predators, about finding shelter. But what if a few of them took dreaming a step further, the way we did? What if they began to imagine things that had never happened before? What if they pictured new tools, new ways to get food, new ways to protect themselves? Those kinds of dreams, repeated over generations, can fundamentally change the way a species lives. Once you have a mind that can imagine something different from what it currently has, you have the seed of invention. The step from using a found object as a tool to deliberately shaping an object for a specific purpose is small in evolutionary terms, but it is enormous in its consequences. It means you are no longer entirely at the mercy of your environment. You can begin to change it. You can build. You can prepare for things that have not yet happened. And if you can share that skill with others, you can pass it along, refine it, and create traditions that last far beyond a single lifetime. We have seen the very beginnings of this in the species alive today. Chimpanzees teach each other how to strip leaves from a branch to make a tool for gathering termites. Certain birds can learn how to bend bits of wire to reach food, and that knowledge then spreads through the group. Dolphins in particular regions develop unique hunting techniques, passing them down to their young. These are the building blocks of culture, and they exist entirely outside of humanity. They show us that intelligence isn't an all-or-nothing quality, but a spectrum, and that we are part of a much larger family of problem solvers. If we take that understanding and look back into the deep past, it's not hard to imagine that some ancient branch of life might have reached a level of cooperation, planning, and innovation far beyond what we see in other species today. The difference between clever tool use and a true civilization is really just a matter of degree and time. It requires a stable environment for long enough that ideas can accumulate, techniques can improve, and knowledge can spread widely enough that it becomes part of the very fabric of life. Given millions of years, even a modest start could lead to something remarkable. But what would it take for that leap to happen? Large brains certainly help, but they aren't everything. Social structure matters. Intelligence grows when there's a need to understand and predict the behavior of others in your group. Communication matters. The ability to share complex ideas quickly means that a brilliant discovery isn't lost when one individual dies. And curiosity matters. The drive to explore beyond the immediate needs of survival is what can lead to completely new possibilities. In our own case, all of these things align just right. Perhaps they aligned once before, in some other lineage, under different skies and surrounded by different creatures. We often imagine any other intelligent life taking the same shape it has in us. An upright posture, hands with fine motor control, eyes that face forward, a voice capable of complex sounds. But those are just the tools our particular body plan happened to offer. Another species might have built its intelligence on entirely different foundations. It might have been aquatic, using fins or tentacles to manipulate its environment. It might have been a species that could fly, using its perspective from above to navigate and plan. It might have been small, relying on huge numbers and cooperation, rather than individual size and strength. Intelligence is adaptable. It finds ways to express itself through whatever physical form it has. If there were such a species, their dreams might have been just as varied as ours. Perhaps they imagined better ways to catch food or safer ways to raise their young. Perhaps they told each other stories, even if those stories took a form we wouldn't recognize as language. Perhaps they decorated their shelters or created sounds or patterns simply because they enjoyed them. Art is one of the most mysterious and powerful signs of intelligence because it is not strictly necessary for survival. It suggests a mind that values beauty or symbolism or the pure act of creation itself. And that is the kind of mind that might leave traces worth finding. Of course, most dreams never leave a physical mark. Even in our own history, the vast majority of what we think and imagine vanishes the moment we wake. Civilizations leave behind only a tiny fraction of what they create. And that fraction is incredibly vulnerable to time. The older the evidence, the more likely it is to be completely erased. So if the first minds that dreamed also built, they would have needed to build in ways that could survive the slow, grinding erosion of the ages. Stone lasts longer than wood. Fired clay lasts longer than woven fibers. Metal can endure for a while, but it can also corrode completely given enough time and the right conditions. Without preservation against all odds, most of what any civilization makes will eventually disappear. This is where the difficulty of proving such a thing becomes so clear. Even in our own cities, built with all the technology we have, the process of decay starts almost immediately. Without constant maintenance, roads crack and buildings crumble. In a few centuries, the outlines of streets might still be visible from the air, but in a few thousand years, the ground might have swallowed them entirely. In a million years, they could be nothing more than faint, subtle differences in the composition of the soil. And in tens of millions of years, they might be gone beyond any hope of recognition. That is why, when scientists seriously consider the possibility of an earlier civilization, they often look for indirect signs. Things like changes in the chemistry of ancient rocks, sudden shifts in climate that could be linked to industrial activity, or deposits of materials that don't seem to occur naturally. These kinds of things are far less vulnerable to erosion than a building or a tool. They are the geological equivalent of footprints on a very, very old path. But even those are incredibly rare, and nature is perfectly capable of producing strange and unexpected results all on its own. Separating what is artificial from what is natural can be a monumental challenge, especially when you're looking back tens of millions of years. Still, the thought remains. Somewhere, at some point in the Earth's long and tumultuous history, it is not beyond the realm of possibility that the first minds capable of dreaming in the way that we do took the first tentative steps towards something greater. Maybe they lived in small scattered groups at first, navigating a landscape full of predators and unpredictable weather. Maybe they learned to shelter in caves, or to build nests or platforms that lasted beyond a single season. Maybe they began to use fire, or some other form of controlled energy. With each small step, their world would have changed. And with each change, the gap between their lives and the lives of the other creatures around them would have grown just a little bit wider. If they ever reached the point where they could alter their environment on a large scale, they might have spread into new territories, adapting to different climates and resources. Trade could have emerged, even if it was nothing more than the simple exchange of rare materials or food between different groups. Over a vast amount of time, their knowledge could have accumulated until they had something that resembled our own early cities, centers where ideas, goods, and skills all came together. The details are completely unknowable, but the path itself is familiar. It is the one we walked, and it is one that evolution could have laid down more than once. Whether they left anything behind that we could find today is another matter entirely. The record of life on Earth is full of enormous gaps, even for species that we know for a fact existed. Most of the story is missing, with only scattered, isolated fragments remaining to hint at what was once there. And that is why this idea is so maddeningly difficult to prove or disprove. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply the natural result of how our planet works. Time is always moving, always reshaping, always covering the traces of what came before. And so, we can only imagine those first minds that dreamed. We can picture them in landscapes that are long gone and hear their voices in sounds we can no longer translate. They might have been nothing at all like us, or they might have shared more with us than we expect. The mere possibility is enough to remind us that our place in history is not guaranteed to be unique. Intelligence may be rare, but it may not be singular. The Earth may have hosted it before, and it may well host it again. From here, the question becomes not just whether it could have happened, but what we even mean when we use a word like civilization. When we use the word civilization, it's easy to picture tall stone buildings, wide, paved roads, and intricate art carved into ancient walls. We think of written laws and organized governments, of great gatherings of people all working together to build something bigger than any single individual. But those are just the familiar examples from our own past. If you strip the word down to its absolute essence, it's not really about a specific style of architecture or a particular kind of government. It's about a way of living where knowledge, culture, and technology accumulate over many generations, and where that accumulation fundamentally changes the way a society functions. By that measure, a civilization isn't necessarily tied to how a place looks from the outside. A group could live in structures made entirely of natural, biodegradable materials, leaving no grand ruins behind, and still be a civilization if they had organized systems, shared knowledge, and sophisticated ways of shaping their environment to meet their needs. We tend to imagine stone monuments because they last the longest, but permanence isn't the true measure of a civilization. Complexity is. It's also worth remembering that civilizations can be small. We often think in terms of vast empires, powerful nations, and sprawling cities, because those are the easiest to spot in our own history. But human civilization didn't start that way. It began in scattered, small communities, often connected only by loose networks of trade and shared cultural practices. With no single central authority binding them all together, what made them part of the same broad story was the way they exchanged ideas, passed down techniques, and created a collective cultural memory that lasted beyond any single lifetime. So, if we ask whether there might have been a civilization on Earth before humans, we have to keep that flexibility in mind. It might not have looked anything like ancient Rome or Mesopotamia. It might not have been based on agriculture. It might have relied on entirely different resources, perfectly suited to the species that built it. Even their concept of a city might have been different. Perhaps it wasn't a dense cluster of permanent buildings, but a network of seasonal gathering places, connected by routes that were well known only to those who traveled them. One of the biggest challenges in defining civilization is that we tend to measure it by our own standards. We count writing as a major milestone, but writing is just one way of storing and transmitting knowledge. Complex oral traditions can be incredibly accurate over long periods of time. We value monumental architecture, but a society could create equally sophisticated achievements in forms that vanish quickly, like intricate woven structures, massive carved wood sculptures, or even carefully arranged living plants. We admire large-scale engineering projects, but small, precise interventions in an environment redirecting a stream here, cultivating a specific plant there, can be just as telling. If a non-human civilization existed millions of years ago, it's very likely that their way of life wouldn't fit neatly into our categories. They might not have farmed in neat rows or herded animals in fenced pastures. They might not have left behind pottery or metal tools. They could have worked entirely with organic materials, using advanced techniques that left no obvious trace once those materials decayed. In that case, the evidence of their existence would be more likely to appear as subtle patterns in the landscape, altered waterways, unusual soil compositions, or the sudden, unexplained appearance of certain plant species far from their native ranges. This is where the definition of civilization matters so much. If we limit it to what we already recognize from our own history, we risk missing all the signs of other possibilities. But if we expand it to include any sustained, organized way of life that intentionally shapes its environment and preserves knowledge, we open ourselves up to a much wider range of potential evidence. That doesn't mean we should call every animal society a civilization. Ants and bees have incredibly complex social structures, but they operate almost entirely on instinct, without the kind of cultural evolution and innovation we see in humans. The key difference is innovation that builds on itself, producing changes over time that aren't just genetic, but are learned and shared. Consider how archaeologists determine if a past human group was part of a civilization. They look for signs of long-distance trade, specialized labor, symbolic expression, and the ability to support communities larger than an immediate family group. None of these things require stone buildings. None of them require metal. They simply require organization, cooperation, and a shared culture. These are the markers that could, in theory, appear in the fossil record of a non-human species, though finding them would be incredibly difficult without direct artifacts. There's also the question of how long a civilization needs to last before we consider it significant. Some human civilizations have endured for thousands of years, while others have risen and fallen within just a few centuries. In geological terms, even 1,000 years is barely a flicker of time. But during that flicker, the impact can be enormous. Forests can be cut down, rivers can be diverted, and species can be moved from one continent to another. Those changes can sometimes be detected in sediment layers, giving us hints about human activity long after the buildings themselves are gone. If a pre-human civilization lasted long enough to alter ecosystems on a large scale, we might expect to see similar traces, even if we didn't immediately recognize them as such. Of course, one of the dangers of this kind of thinking is that nature itself can produce patterns that look completely artificial. A perfectly round hill might be the remains of an ancient volcano rather than a constructed mound. Straight lines in rock formations can form through natural fracturing. Even large-scale changes in vegetation could be caused by climate shifts rather than deliberate planting. This means that to identify a true civilization, we would need multiple lines of evidence changes in the land, unusual material deposits, and possibly even the fossilized remains of the species itself, showing signs of behavior far beyond the ordinary. And that leads to another fascinating consideration. What would the members of this civilization have been like physically? We often assume that intelligence requires a body capable of fine manipulation, like our hands or perhaps tentacles. That's because most of our technology is built with those kinds of tools in mind. But if a civilization evolved with different capabilities, it might have developed technologies that look nothing like ours, perhaps based more on shaping large environments than on crafting small objects. They could have been aquatic, using their environment in ways we'd struggle to reconstruct from the fossil record. They could have been flighted, building temporary structures in trees or on high cliffs. Their intelligence might have been expressed in architecture made entirely of living materials that grew and changed over time. The difficulty of defining civilization is partly why the question of a pre-human one is so intriguing. It forces us to think about intelligence and culture without the comfortable reference points of our own history. It asks us to imagine forms of organization and creation that we might completely overlook if we were only looking for stone cities and bronze tools. It reminds us that our way is just one among many possible ways, and that the rules we think are universal might only be the local customs of our particular species. Even now, when we look at the life all around us, we can see glimpses of these alternative paths. Elephants shape their environment by knocking down trees and digging waterholes, creating changes that last long after they are gone. Some bird species build incredibly elaborate structures just to attract mates, structures that can be reused and added to over time. Whales communicate across vast distances, their songs carrying complex information that may shift with the seasons and the years. None of these quite cross the threshold into civilization as we define it, but they show how close other species can come to the edge of it. In a different context, with different pressures and much more time, those edges could absolutely be crossed. Once we accept that a civilization might not always look like ours, the next question becomes how we would even begin to search for it in the deep past. That search wouldn't start with obvious ruins. It would start with subtle, unexplained anomalies in the geological and fossil records. It would require scientists from many different fields to compare notes, to look at familiar data with fresh eyes, and to ask whether an odd finding might be the product of deliberate action rather than just chance. That's a slow, careful process, and one that could just as easily confirm a natural explanation as it could reveal something truly unexpected. The challenge is enormous, but so is the timescale we're talking about. The Earth has had billions of years to host experiments in life. We know of at least one that produced a civilization, ours. It's not unreasonable to wonder if there might have been another. Whether it left marks we can still find depends entirely on how we define those marks and whether we're willing to see them in forms we never expected. When people imagine uncovering the distant past, they often picture paleontologists standing over a perfectly preserved skeleton, brushing away the last bits of soil to reveal a creature as if it had just fallen asleep a moment ago. The truth is much less dramatic and far more fragile. Most of the past is simply gone. What survives is a random scatter of clues, incomplete and altered, often compressed into forms that no longer look much like what they once were. The scientists who study them work more like translators than treasure hunters. They are reading a language that the Earth has been writing for hundreds of millions of years, in a script shaped by immense pressure, heat, and time. A fossil isn't an object frozen in place. It's a transformation. The original bone, shell, or leaf is replaced, molecule by molecule, with minerals that seep in over ages, eventually hardening into stone. Sometimes, only the impression remains a hollow cast of the outside shape, the shadow of a footprint, a ripple in ancient mud that hardened before it could be disturbed. And just as often, those delicate traces never form at all. They're washed away, broken apart, or buried so deep they will never return to the surface. This is why the fossil record is so patchy. Entire species can live and vanish without leaving behind a single preserved example for us to find. The conditions that create fossils are rare, and they tend to happen only in specific environments. River deltas, lake beds, volcanic ashfalls, and seafloors where sediment collects rapidly. In dry uplands or on shifting coasts, remains are far more likely to be completely destroyed. That means our picture of the past is built from scattered pieces, biased toward the kinds of places that are good at protecting them. For anyone looking for signs of an ancient civilization, that bias is an enormous problem. Even in the short span of human history, our footprint is uneven. Cities built in deserts or floodplains can leave durable remains, while coastal settlements might be completely erased by rising seas or buried under thick layers of sediment. Now, stretch that out over millions of years and imagine how much could vanish entirely. If an advanced society had existed in a region that later became the floor of an ocean, its traces might now be locked under miles of water and mud, far beyond the reach of most exploration. If it lived in a forested land that was later scoured clean by glaciers, its legacy could be wiped so clean that even the original landforms are unrecognizable. The people who sift through the Earth's layers for evidence know this. They work with the understanding that every discovery is just one single point in a vast, mostly invisible web of life that used to exist. They also know that some of the most important finds don't come from complete skeletons, but from tiny fragments. A single tooth can reveal an animal's diet, age, and evolutionary relationships. A thin layer of pollen trapped in sediment can tell the story of ancient climates and forgotten forests. Chemical signatures locked in rock can hint at massive events like volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or even sudden, unexplained shifts in the composition of the atmosphere. Those unexplained shifts are exactly the sort of thing that might point to something unusual, perhaps even to the influence of a civilization. Our own industrial activity has already altered the chemical makeup of the atmosphere in measurable ways, leaving behind a layer of specific carbon isotopes that will be detectable far into the future. Plastics, weird metals, and synthetic compounds are spreading into sediments all around the globe. Even if all our buildings vanished tomorrow, those chemical traces would remain in the geological record for millions of years. The challenge, of course, is that nature can also produce strange patterns in chemistry and sediment. Massive volcanic events can flood the atmosphere with carbon and sulfur. Large-scale die-offs can leave behind layers rich in certain elements. Shifts in ocean currents can redistribute sediments in unusual ways. The fossil whisperers, as you might call them, have to weigh every single possibility before even considering the most extraordinary explanations. In science, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Still, there are moments when the evidence seems to resist the simplest answers. In certain rock layers, scientists have found sudden changes in mineral composition that suggest a rapid introduction of unusual materials, ones that don't seem to fit the slow, steady processes of erosion and deposition. Most of these, in the end, turn out to have perfectly natural explanations. But each time, the question lingers: what if? What if, long before us, there was another hand at work, shaping the environment in ways we don't yet recognize? Finding something like that wouldn't necessarily be as obvious as unearthing a carved statue or a worked piece of metal. It might be much subtler. Patterns in the distribution of minerals that hint at large-scale extraction, deposits of rare compounds that suggest deliberate manufacturing, or a thin, persistent layer of a material whose origin can't be explained by any known natural process. Interpreting such patterns would require not just geology, but chemistry, archaeology, and even an openness to asking questions that sound, at first, improbable. There is a deep patience to this kind of work. Decoding the past isn't a matter of pulling one artifact from the ground and declaring the mystery solved. It's about assembling a body of evidence, piece by tiny piece, until a coherent picture starts to form. And in the case of a possible pre-human civilization, that picture might never be complete. It could remain nothing more than a collection of hints that refuse to fade, inviting speculation without ever confirming it. And that uncertainty is a huge part of the fascination. We live in a time when it's easy to think of the past as something we can neatly map and measure. But in truth, our knowledge is a thin veneer. The fossil record is not a complete history book. It's a set of surviving fragments scattered across the globe, written in a language we are still just beginning to learn how to read. What it tells us is that life has taken forms stranger and more diverse than we ever could have guessed, that entire branches of the evolutionary tree have grown and withered without leaving much of a trace, and that the world we know is just the latest version of a planet that has reinvented itself countless times. In that light, the idea of another civilization, lost so completely that it survives only in the faintest of geological whispers, doesn't seem entirely impossible. If the planet itself remembers, but not in the way that we do, then its memory is a strange and powerful thing. Our memories are collections of moments, snapshots we can revisit, sometimes vivid, sometimes blurred. The planet's memory is slower, heavier, written in stone and ice and sediment. It keeps its records in layers, each one built from the debris of what came before. But it's also a deeply forgetful memory, constantly rewriting itself, sanding down old impressions, and burying some completely under the weight of new ones. It has no sense of nostalgia, no attachment to preserving a scene for the sake of history. The Earth changes simply because that's what it has always done. If we could somehow peel back the crust of the Earth like the pages of a book, we'd see a story with long chapters, and even entire volumes, missing. Whole periods of time are gone, erased not because they were unimportant, but because the processes that shape the planet are relentless. Mountains rise when tectonic plates collide, only to crumble under millennia of wind and rain. Oceans spread when plates drift apart, then shrink again as the land closes in. Volcanoes pour out thick layers of new rock, covering whatever was there before. Ice sheets grind across continents, stripping away the surface like cosmic sandpaper. Even the quiet, patient work of rivers, carrying silt from one place to another, can bury old landscapes and create entirely new ones. The surface we see today is not the same one that existed 1 million years ago, or 10 million, or 100 million. Every single place on Earth has been reshaped over and over again. This constant recycling of the crust means that the older something is, the less likely it is to survive in a form we can recognize. For the traces of any civilization to last beyond a few tens of millions of years, they would need extraordinary luck. They would have to be preserved in a uniquely stable geological setting, one that was not submerged by oceans, crushed by mountains, or scraped away by ice. Even then, the evidence would likely be distorted. Heat and pressure can change the very structure of rock, melting or warping anything embedded within it. This is why so much of Earth's earliest history is known only in outline. The first billion years of our planet's existence are represented by only a few surviving fragments of rock. The rest is gone, recycled back into the mantle and brought to the surface again as new rock, with all the original markings wiped clean. It's not only geology that erases the past. Climate and biology can be just as thorough. A jungle can reclaim a city in a matter of decades, hiding it under thick layers of soil, vines, and trees. Insects and microbes will dismantle wood, leather, and cloth. Salt water corrodes even the strongest metals. On a human timescale, our ruins may seem permanent, but compared to the lifespan of the planet, they are the briefest of interruptions. If we vanish tomorrow, the most visible signs of our presence, our roads, our buildings, our bridges, would be fading within a century. In 10,000 years, most would be gone or completely unrecognizable. In a million years, only scattered traces might remain, buried deep in sediments or transformed into new minerals. And after 10 million years, the changes we made to the land might be visible only as subtle patterns. A straightened river here, a deposit of unusual elements there. The rest would be overwritten by the slow, powerful processes that never stop. That is what makes the search for deep history so incredibly challenging. We aren't looking for intact artifacts, but for the tiniest fragments that have survived in spite of everything working against them. And the older we look, the more we have to accept that the record will be incomplete, perhaps hopelessly so. There are entire continents worth of history that we will never know, not because it's hidden from us, but because it is gone in every meaningful sense of the word. Even the ocean floor, which might seem like a safe place to store the past, is constantly being renewed. The crust beneath the deep oceans is young by geological standards, because it's continuously being pushed back down into the mantle at subduction zones. That means anything older than about 200 million years that was on the ocean floor, no matter how well preserved at the time, has been utterly destroyed. And yet, this imperfect memory is all we have to work with. The scientists who study it are constantly weighing what's preserved against what's missing, trying to reconstruct a story from uneven evidence. When they find a fossil in good condition, it's because of a rare alignment of circumstances: quick burial, stable conditions, and protection from scavengers and decay. The exact same would be true for any artifact of a civilization. It would have had to be buried rapidly, and in a place where it could avoid total destruction for millions of years. Even then, recognition would be a massive hurdle. A worked piece of stone could be mistaken for a natural formation. A strange mineral deposit could be dismissed as the result of unusual but natural chemistry. Without a clear context, a set of associated finds that all point in the same direction, it would be easy to overlook or misinterpret the evidence. This is why thinking about the planet's memory changes how we think about the possibility of a lost civilization. It's not enough to just imagine what they might have built. We have to imagine how those things would interact with the forces of erosion, subduction, and decay over unimaginable spans of time. We have to picture what, if anything, would survive, and in what form. And we have to accept that most of it would not survive at all. What the planet does remember, it remembers in ways we can measure. Chemical traces locked in rocks, tiny fossils sealed in amber, impressions of leaves pressed into ancient mud. These are the precious fragments that slip through the constant rewriting of the surface. They are precious not because they give us a complete picture, but because they give us any picture at all. The rest is lost, as if it never happened. And that, more than anything, is why we can't be certain what the Earth has hosted before us. If the planet is capable of wiping away almost everything we've done in just a few million years, then it's capable of having done the same to others. Its memory is long, but it is selective, and it keeps its secrets very, very well. If there were others before us, beings who dreamed, built, and then vanished, their presence would now be little more than the faintest of signatures, if that. The question is whether we've already passed over some of those signatures without recognizing them, or whether they're still buried deep, waiting for just the right conditions to finally be uncovered.